The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, your AML automation software for faster onboarding, smarter monitoring, and growth without overhead.
There's an old joke about a policeman finding a man scrabbling around on the ground underneath a lamppost. And he says, are you all right, sir? And he says, I'm looking for my keys. And the policeman said, oh, did you lose them here? And he said, no, I lost them in the park, but it's dark there, so I'm looking here where I can see. And it feels like that about the way that we look for money laundering.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML, compliance, and financial crime to the real world. In this industry, we are constantly told that the criminals are one step ahead. We've accepted the idea that we are playing a permanent game of catch-up against an enemy that's simply better, stronger, and faster. But what if the very systems we built to stop them are actually giving them the lead? What if the structures put in place decades ago are the reason that trillions in laundered money remains out of reach? I'm your host, Marit, CEO of Strise, and in this episode, we are asking, have we got anti-money laundering all wrong? We will be discussing the biggest flaws in the current system, as spelled out by our guest, a world tour that connects Bicester Village, Texas, and the Marshall Islands, and do we give up the fight against bad actors? And to dive into this topic, I'm very pleased to announce that I'm here with Oliver Bullough, writer and author of books including Butler to the World, Money Land, and his latest, Everybody Loves Our Dollars, How Money Laundering Won. Welcome back to The Laundry, Oliver. It's actually the third time you're on, so it's a pleasure having you back.
I'm really glad to be back. I'm really looking forward to this.
The last time you were here, we talked about the upcoming Trump presidency. And luckily that's looking all calmer now. So no, nothing there. But today it's all about, have we gotten anti-money laundering wrong? Let's just dive into the discussion. And I've read your books, and it's almost like a film trilogy about financial crime. You had Butler to the World, how Britain's role in serving the ultra-wealthy and corrupt. Money Land looks at the global picture of money movement for kleptocrats using countries with weak jurisdictions. And now the third one, Everybody Loves Our Dollars, is about how the system built to stop this dark movement of money have failed. So if you look at this trilogy, who is the overarching big bad villain?
You've started with a tough question. Kind of a really important part of what I do is to try and argue against the idea that there is a big bad villain. I think if there was a single villain, with a white cat in a swivel chair like in the James Bond films, I think solving issues around financial crime would be a lot easier than they are. I think that the problem is far more serious and runs far deeper than that. It feels to me, and I thought about this quite a lot, that in humans we have two instincts. One is greed, to acquire as much stuff as we can, and the other is the instinct for justice, for that society should be as fair as it can be. And they are obviously in tension with each other. My own desire for more against a desire for society to be fair. And yet it seems that certainly in the last, I suppose 50, 60, 70 years, the period that I've been writing about in my three books, beginning in the 1950s, but really accelerating up to the present day, greed has been prioritized over justice. It's been because of the way globalization has worked, the way that money can find easy places to hide in different jurisdictions and different parts of jurisdictions. It's become much easier for people to accumulate money and power and stuff in a way that violates principles of basic fairness. So, if I have a villain in my mind, it is the system that allows that to happen. And I'm constantly trying to find different ways of tunneling into that system, of explaining how it works and revealing its inner mechanisms. And I suppose, in this trilogy, I hadn't really thought of them as a trilogy before, but in this trilogy, I've just trying to look at different ways of doing that.
If the system of greed almost is the big bad villain, who is the hero in this trilogy?
I'm just really inspired by people who refuse to accept that the system should be this way, whether that's people like Daria Kaleniuk and Vitaly Shabunin of the Anti-Corruption Action Center in Kyiv, or, investigative journalists in places like Angola, South Africa, fighting against, resurgent kleptocracy, or people like, Alexei Navalny the late lamented Alexei Navalny in Russia, people who, despite the fact that kleptocracy is 99% established, say, no, that's not how it's going to be, and that they're going to stand in the way of that happening. That almost sort of dissident model, they're the people that I tend to be most inspired by, and they're the people who, I kind of write, I suppose in my head, they're the people I write for.
I also agree with you. I'm also really inspired by all those stories, and journalists in particular in different jurisdictions who risk a lot by exposing bad actors as well, and who risk their own lives and their families' lives. I always find that like very also motivating to keep being in this field, although I do it from a different angle. But on the latest book, Everybody Loves Our Dollars, on the front page of this book, you make the case money laundering has won. Do you really believe that?
Up to now, right? This is a battle that hasn't ended. So I suppose you could argue, maybe it's half time if it were a football match, but so far, absolutely, money laundering is well ahead. I think if you look at the amount of money, the amount of effort that is expended globally to try and combat money laundering, to restrict it, and I suppose to try and end it, and then you compare that with the volume of money that, as far as we can tell from the best estimates we have, is being laundered, we are failing completely. The system that has been created, which is astonishingly expensive. If you look at the estimates from LexisNexis, the global compliance industry costs somewhere north of 200 billion US dollars every year. What could you do with $200 billion? Well, according to the United Nations, that would be enough money to end world hunger and to provide clean water and sanitation to everyone on Earth. And you'd have around $50 billion left over. This is a huge amount of money that governments are requiring the private sector to spend on tackling money laundering. And so on top of that, we have to consider what governments themselves spend, which is considerably less, but still a substantial amount of money. And yet, despite this massive expenditure, there is no sign that we're succeeding or even reducing the scale of the problem. So, yeah, money laundering's won. I don't think that anyone would really dispute with that. I mean, to be honest, while researching the book, I was kind of hoping I'd find someone who'd say, oh, no, you've got this all wrong. It's going really well. But on the contrary, everyone was like, yeah, it's pretty bad.
Yeah, I also wrote a piece the other day in a newspaper in Norway about like it doesn't help banks spending billions and billions and billions, and we just put the regulation around there, if the public institutions, if other sectors aren't really kept up to it as well, because it doesn't work if you just try to fix one little part of a huge system, it's just going to leak everywhere else. But talking about governments, regulations, how we got to where we are today, your book actually lays out the history of how we gotten to the terms and regulations that the compliance industry use on a daily. So the Right to Patman and the Bank Secrecy Act, etc. So what did you kind of find out by taking it back to the origins? Was there like a point in time since, we started with the Bank Secrecy Act in 1970s, I guess, where you thought, oh man, it was this point in time where it all went wrong?
Well, I'm actually really proud of having dug into the history of Wright Patman and the Bank Secrecy Act. I think he's a really incredible guy, actually, responsible for not just, anti-money laundering law. The whole idea of anti-money laundering law was him, but lots of other incredible things as well. I think he's well overdue, like a massive biography, one of those huge biographies that American biographers write, like a 1,500 pages. But leaving that aside, I spent a lot of time in his archive in Texas, which was fascinating. I visited his hometown, his home village and the nearest town, Texarkana. So that was super interesting. What's kind of amazing to take from him is the idea that before him, there was no idea that banks or anyone had any responsibility to stop money laundering at all. It was almost like the financial system before that was just the pipes through which money moved, and the origin of that money was of no more significance to the bank than, a sewage company would be interested in what you had for dinner. It was just pipes, money moved from A to B. It was Wright Patman who said, actually, it's really important that criminals aren't able to launder the proceeds of their wealth, and banks have a responsibility to stop that. So the Bank Secrecy Act actually is a really interesting and important beginning where things began to go right. He recognized even before the legislation was passed, when they were having these congressional hearings, that the problem was a far more significant one than he was going to be able to do anything about. Because that was, back in the 1960s when they were having those hearings, that was the beginning of, really extreme globalization, when money, because of, the new technology, because of jet aeroplanes and so on, money could move internationally in a way that it had never been able to do before. So it was very easy just to skip from, for example, Florida to the Bahamas, or Florida to Panama, Florida to the Cayman Islands, and evade the United States jurisdiction, which, and the legislation that he brought in. So you then go forward to, I think, where things start to go wrong, which is, start to really have the fault and the problems embedded within them, which is in 1989 in the foundation of the Financial Action Task Force, which is, again, has a weird origin story. I'm not going to go into it, but it's not what you might think. And the kind of compromises that were made between the members of the G7 at the creation of the FATF, and particularly that of the Suspicious Activity Report, the idea that essentially private companies would be deputized to look for suspicion on behalf of the authorities, which is to say that the authorities would only investigate wrongdoing if they'd been alerted to it by the wrongdoers themselves. You're expecting money launderers to blow the whistle on themselves. And, the unintended consequence of this, or possibly, I'm not sure whether unintended is the word, possibly not unexamined consequence of this, is that you end up with a mountain of paperwork and bureaucracy and compliance for people who are prepared to do the right thing, and yet a very easy escape route for people who don't care whether they do the right thing or not. You have large institutions that want to do the right thing, have to spend a huge amount of money with massive compliance teams. And yet, if you are, essentially a crook, a crooked lawyer, a crooked financier or whatever, you can just continue money laundering and not blow the whistle on yourself. And then your chances of being caught are really very small indeed. And so I think it was that moment when the ideas inherent in Wright-Patman's anti-money laundering idea in the Bank Secrecy Act was scaled up internationally, and compromises were reached to bring other countries on board, particularly in that case the United Kingdom, but others too, that the ideas become watered down to such an extent that they've just become unmanageable and become essentially a giant propagator of bureaucracy, and not actually something that stops money laundering in any meaningful sense.
Okay, so we started out quite in a good spot with the Bank Secrecy Act, or it was a right direction, and then went a little bit wrong turn with the creation of the FATF, or at least how it ended up being. And were there any other historical moments in the past where you thought like, oh, this was a bit back to the right path, or this again was like, oh no, we're deviating even more from the origin where it all started?
This was, as an idea, tackling money laundering originated in the United States. Other countries have gone down this route to a greater or lesser extent. I mean, obviously, Italy has done quite well because of its historic problems with organized crime. But really, the core of the issue is that most governments don't care, and they need to be persuaded to care. Now, there are two ways of persuading people to care. You can either coerce them, which is another huge problem that I write about in the book. You mentioned the Marshall Islands, with the kind of blacklisting of small, essentially blameless might not be the word, but essentially unimportant jurisdictions, like the Marshall Islands. That I think is a problem that needs to be talked about more. And then the other one, though, is if you want to try and bring a big country, like the United Kingdom or Switzerland or whatever, on board, then you have to water down the measures in a way that they will be prepared to sign up to them. And then that creates a problem, which means that the measures become so watered down that they are essentially unimportant and insignificant. So, there is a real problem, which is if we have a globalized financial system, which means that every country's regulation and enforcement is of essentially, if not equal significance, then certainly of significance, then you need to try and bring all of those countries with you. But if those countries don't particularly want to go where you want them to go, then you end up with a system that is distinctly, I suppose, what you might call suboptimal at the most generous assessment.
So, talking about the FATF again, we spoke to the current acting president, Elisa de Anda Madrazo, in a recent episode of The Laundry. And I met her, and she was, had this intensity about her, intent. Like, it seemed she really wanted to do the right thing. She had spoke clearly about her vision, etc. But do you think this can become better under the right leadership? Or is it, in your words, kind of watered down too much, then it's almost impossible to impact it?
Listen, I don't want to suggest that the FATF has done nothing worthwhile. I suppose spreading the ideas of the importance of tackling money laundering globally is an achievement of sorts. But in terms of actual results, I think there's a real problem around this whole essentially idea of trying to boil the ocean. The idea that you solve money laundering, all of it, in one go, and not actually just money laundering, because since 2001, money laundering and terrorist finance all in one go with one institution. An institution which doesn't have coercive powers of its own, that can't really do anything but essentially try and persuade people to go along with it. I've spoken to people who work now for the FATF or who have worked in the past. Yeah, they're all, good people, very knowledgeable, very concerned about the issue that they're working in and very aware of the urgency of what they're doing. But I just think it's important, to look at results. There's this saying, that the purpose of an organization is what it does. The FATF was created in 1989. I was, 11 when the FATF was created. I'm middle-aged now. That's a long time ago. What has it achieved in terms of actual achievement? It's blacklisted a load of countries. It has managed to persuade countries to adopt a lot of pieces of legislation. But in terms of real results, it's pretty feeble, to be honest. In terms of reducing money laundering, has it? I can't see any sign that it has. In terms of reducing terrorist financing, you just have to look at around the world and ask, are the terrorist groups, any less significant and less powerful now than they were back in 2001 when the FATF took over that responsibility? Obviously, they're not. So it's just failed, and I think we need to recognize that no matter how nice or hardworking the people involved in the FATF are, and no matter, how worthy their intentions and how interesting the publications they produce, and all of those things definitely true. Just results wise, has it led to a reduction of money laundering? Has it led to a reduction of terrorism because by interdicting terrorist financing? No, it hasn't.
Obviously, this is not something that most people go around thinking about. And when there's elections, you think about the better school system and more money to healthcare, and you don't really connect it to, oh, we should also solve money laundering. But what should the kind of normal citizen do or require from their governmental leaders in order to solve this problem?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. The first part of it, why is it something that people don't think about? If you look at crime, leaving aside crimes of passion, which are obviously very, very important in their own right, but they're different. If you look at acquisitive crime, murder, it doesn't count in this case, but fraud, theft, trafficking, all of that stuff. The vast bulk of crime that is really ruining the lives of hundreds of millions of people around the world. Why is that happening? That's happening because people can keep what they steal. And why can they keep what they steal? Well, because it's so easy to launder it and make that stolen money look like legitimate money. The global money laundering system is the support industry for the worst people in the world. So it should be something that I think if people understood how it worked and how prevalent it was, it should be something that they would be demanding more action from their politicians on. And so I think that partly my job and the job of lots of journalists is to try and make that case, to explain, how important this is and how it isn't just white collar crimes of which don't really affect ordinary people, but this is the support industry for things that really, really affect you, whether that's your grandmother being defrauded or whether that's, human trafficking or drug trafficking or whatever. In terms of what requires doing, the point to me is that if you want to fight money laundering, you need to fight money laundering. You can't just outsource this to the private sector and say to them, here's a load of rules you have to follow. If you don't follow those rules, we're going to fine you. That's not a good way of going about that. That just means that private sector companies will adjust their behavior in such a way they don't get fined. Their instinct is not to stop money laundering. Their instinct is to not be fined themselves. Governments have to get really involved as well. And particularly, there's a story I tell towards the end of the book, which is one I found really, really interesting because I was just looking for an example of what success looks like. And it's the success of the United Kingdom specifically in tackling a particular kind of VAT fraud called carousel fraud, which was a massive problem, multi-billion pound loss to the UK Treasury in the early 2000s, and a form of fraud that was baked into the way that VAT worked within the European Union that made it incredibly difficult to do anything about. And it wasn't something that could be solved by the standard, compliance-focused approach that governments take to tackling financial crime otherwise. And the way that the British government went at tackling carousel fraud was a full system approach. It was diplomatic, it was law enforcement, it was legislative in terms of changing rules. Yes, there was compliance involved, and there was a lot of sort of outreach and behavior changing as well. But it was a full system approach, really well thought through, and and totally focused, with all the resources that were required, thousands of people thrown at this job. And that has not been done with money laundering. No one looks at this and says, what would it look like if the government threw everything at stopping money laundering? If they were to recognize that if you're going to fight something, you need to really fight it. So the reason I tell that story in the book, and obviously there's a lot more to it than that, and hopefully if people read the book, they will agree with me. The reason I tell that story in the book is to say, this is what success looks like. This is what it's required. It isn't enough to just say to financial professionals, you need to give us suspicious activity reports. And then those SARs pile up in giant databases. There's so many of them in the hundreds of thousands that no one has time to even look at them. That isn't enough. What you need to do is use the intelligence that's being generated and to put as much effort in on that side of things as you are demanding of other people to do effort on the compliance side.
I mean, that is the never-ending topic of any compliance conference I attend, is the private sector asking, hey, we are filing all these SARs. Have you read them? Can you give us feedback? What's happening with them? And the government can just never reply to those. And it just ends up being statistics. And the SAR filings just go up and up every year, and it just remains a statistic. But just talking about this VAT fraud, because that is a topic I'm actually very passionate about, and we've done episodes on it in the podcast. And I'm great to hear that there is a success story in the UK, because I feel that VAT refund frauds is still ongoing. It's a huge problem in Europe still, and
It's
even
massive,
in
yeah.
it's massive, and in Norway as well. There are some great journalists in, especially in the largest business paper in Norway, who are now bringing this topic to the surface. And I'm, of course, following this story. And it's just shocking, some of the stories that come out. It's fake VAT refunds paid out from the tax authorities, and it goes hand in hand with a lot of social benefit fraud. And of course, those companies as well, human trafficking. It's just a never ending story. And it just shocks me that I read these stories in the newspaper, and the kind of result is that a politician replies back with, like, oh, yeah, that is concerning. And
Yeah,
the
I
story
mean,
just ends there. And I'm like, come on, politicians, it's like you are deciding not to decide. What you need to do now is actually take some action. And we cannot have this circular argument that the tax authorities are pointing the finger to the investigative unit and say, hey, you should investigate more tax frauds. And then, the social benefit company in Norway is like, oh, but the company registration, our version of Companies House, you should be more thorough about checking companies. So it's just this never ending circular argument where no one is really putting up their hand and be like, yes, this is a problem. We own it. We are going to do something. And you just move everyone along. It just shocks me, actually.
I completely agree. I mean, I think one thing that's interesting in the UK, because they put so much effort into this in the early 2000s in a way that most European countries did not at the time. I mean, Germany and Austria put a certain amount in, but most European countries didn't put the same kind of effort in. And it's taken root in many European countries. It's created these cross-continental organized criminal groups existing solely to defraud the VAT system, which are now so deeply embedded and so profitable that it's very hard to imagine now how you would root that out. But I do think that the model that I laid out in that chapter, which is about a whole system approach. It's not enough to just look at the corporate registry. It's not enough to just look at the financial system. It's not enough to just look at the legislature. You have to do everything at once. And if you do that, then you can start to reduce the problem. But that's a really important point to recognize, that you're never going to end money laundering. Money laundering will be with us as long as there is theft. As long as it is profitable to steal things, you will find a way to launder that money. The challenge is to make it difficult that it becomes expensive, and therefore you take the profit out of certain kinds of acquisitive crime. That's the aim. But right now, it's so easy to launder money.
Your data problem?
And your workflow problem?
Now it isn't your problem. Strise is your ultimate solution to streamline customer due diligence and perpetual KYC.
Transforming your AML strategy from a manual burden to an automated winner.
Nice.
With AI-centric automation at its heart, Strise fast-tracks your time to revenue.
And because we know the future is as uncertain as it is exciting,
Strise is modular by design.
Prepare for tomorrow's risks and regulations today. With flexibility that adapts to whatever the future holds.
And best of all,
you experience value from day one. Instant use out of the box.
Visit Strise.ai and try our live demo today.
Back to the show. What's one of the stories when you researched and wrote this book that, that stuck with you about how easy it was, or like that shocked you in particular?
Well, just about everything shocks me, to be honest. I mean, it's weird. I've been researching this stuff for quite a while now, and yet I remain very easily shockable by just the sheer idiocy of so much of the system. I think one thing that I'm obsessed by, and I don't understand why more people aren't interested in, because I think it's genuinely extraordinary, is cash money, banknotes. They are in use in all countries around the world, less and less every year. A lot of countries still use them more than other ones. So in the UK and in Scandinavian countries, they're used relatively little. I understand in Germany and Austria, they're used more, but still in every country, they're used less than they used to be, and less every year. And yet the amount of banknotes in circulation in all major countries goes up and up and up. In the European Union, the Eurozone, they just hit an all-time high. In the United States, they hit an all-time high every month. In the UK, it's an all-time high every month. What is the demand for these banknotes? Who is using them? It's the most extraordinary question, because occasionally central banks come up with an answer. They've noticed this paradox, 15 years ago, and occasionally they come up with an answer. It's because of inflation, or it's because of there being more ATMs, or it's because of distrust in the financial system. And yet time goes on and these factors cease to be relevant, and yet they still are witnessing the same thing. They're still printing more banknotes. I mean, the answer is obvious to me, that this is just essentially a proxy for the growing size of the criminal economy, because who else is using banknotes in the kind of volume in which they're being printed? I mean, they're printing so many dollars that they're building a whole new facility in Maryland to print more of them, because the two facilities they've got can't keep up with the demand. And that is astonishing if on one hand you have governments insisting on ever more intrusive checks on financial transactions to try and control money laundering, while at the same time they're producing ever more banknotes to enable money laundering simultaneously. The same government. It's like one hand you're doing one thing, and on the other hand, you're essentially doing the opposite. And this, to me, is just indicative of the failure to understand the whole problem, the failure to think about it, to engage with it, to really care about it. And it's particularly hypocritical and egregious because printing banknotes is a really profitable thing to do. The profit from it's a slightly crude way of calculating it, but it's not an unfair way of looking at it. The profit of printing a $100 bill is about $99.90. It's just about the most profitable thing you can produce, short perhaps of a cryptocurrency. And yet, they are raking in these very significant profits for their treasuries from printing currency, while at the same time imposing significant costs on other people to tackle financial crime. And this kind of hypocrisy, frankly, makes me very annoyed.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in Norway as well lately, there's been the discussion about what is the equivalent of the Norwegian $100 bill, and it was the media made this story. It's like, we have this banknote, you've probably never seen one, it's almost impossible to get one too. And it was something, I think it was 8.5 or 9 million of these, the 100 or 1,000 NOK bank bill in circulation in Norway, in a country with less than 6 million people. And the journalists really had to dig deep to even find one, because it's just, where are they? They're just gone. No one has ever seen one. But I did see now, luckily, that we're gonna maybe phase out this. But it's just crazy, right? And then there's all these arguments. No, it's like, what if we need it for security in case, the payment system goes offline? And
the amazing thing about dollars is that the $100 bill, which in a similar way to what you're talking about, you very rarely see them if you're in the United States, as opposed to $20 bills, which you see all the time. The $100 bill is the most printed banknote. There are more of them out there, not just by value, but by actual number, than there are dollar bills or $20 bills. It is the most popular banknote. And by the Federal Reserve's own calculations, something like 70% of all of those $100 bills are outside the United States. So it's just essentially a giant interest-free loan to the US government by foreign criminals. While at the same time, you've got Howard Lutnick in Davos this week talking about how there's a new sheriff in town determined to crack down on money laundering and cartels and so on. It's like, well, and yet you're printing the most useful instrument that they have for laundering money. I mean, this is obviously, there are many other aspects of money laundering we could talk about, whether that's, crypto or trade-based money laundering that I'm particularly interested in or whatever. But foundational to it from a hypocrisy perspective is the fact that the most basic form of money laundering involves cash, and that is something produced by governments, that they have their own decisions that they could make about which banknotes they print, which banknotes they discontinue, how many banknotes they print. And yet they just don't take any of those decisions. They just, if the criminals want them, they give them to them.
Very true. I actually have a $100 bill at home. Last summer, I was spent 3 weeks in Lebanon. And then, of course, the economy there is dollar cash based. So you just pay with dollars. And then when I got home, I saw, I have a $100 bill left. So I was like, I put it in my living room on top of a book as a reminder, actually. So I see it every day as a good reminder. But you spoke about trade-based money laundering. Why don't you talk to me a little bit about why you find that so fascinating and interesting?
One of the issues about money laundering that I think it's important to recognize, and because this is a kind of, I think we're among nerds here, so I think we can nerd out a little bit in how we talk about money laundering, is that we're not actually talking about money laundering at all. We're talking about value laundering. It doesn't matter what form the value is when you take it and launder it and try and make it look legitimate. It can be in the form of anything at all. And if we only look at it in the form of money, whether that's in the form of bank deposits or in the form of bank notes, then, we have a problem, because we're missing a frankly really important store of value around the world, which is the form of stuff. And, as there have been ever more intrusive checks on the world financial system imposed by legislation enforcing compliance and so on, and they are very intrusive now. I mean, I get into this in the book. Probably don't need to tell you this, but some of the side effects of the kind of intrusion are really appalling in terms of who gets excluded from the financial system. There are absolutely no equivalent checks at all on the global trade system. It is incredibly easy to move stuff from one country to another, put it in a container, move it to another country without any checks at all, particularly if you route it through one of the very many free ports, including the really big ones, whether they're in Panama or the United Arab Emirates or wherever. So it's really obvious. I mean, criminals are, criminal financiers are as clever as any other financiers and as entrepreneurial as anyone. They can see the weak points in the system as well as, or if not rather better than we can. If it's, difficult to move a sum of money from, one country to another because it's going to pass through the eyes of a compliance department, don't bother. Just move an equivalent amount of value in the form of goods via, whether that's in the global shipping industry, or just put an expensive wristwatch on and fly from one country to another and sell it when you get to the other end. Moving value in the form of stuff is what we call trade-based money laundering. And, there's an issue. I mean, there's an old joke about a policeman finding a man scrabbling around on the ground underneath a lamppost. And he says, are you all right, sir? And he says, I'm looking for my keys. And the policeman said, oh, did you lose them here? And he said, no, I lost them in the park, but it's dark there, so I'm looking here where I can see. And it feels like that about the way that we look for money laundering. It's relatively easy to look for the movement of money in bank spreadsheets because everything is in money form. You can search for it. You can use AI to try and look for various discrepancies. Looking for the movement of value in the trade system is incredibly hard. Everything is different. Everything moves, in containers, which you have to open and look at them. And therefore, this is how people move value. I mean, this is obviously assisted by the fact that many of the world's ports are controlled by organized criminals anyway. So, trade-based money laundering is the giant elephant in the room that governments just don't look at, address, recognize, acknowledge at all. Because if they did, they would need to come up with some really imaginative and new ways of tackling the movement of value around the world. And frankly, I don't think any of them know how to do that or even have any idea how to begin to do that. And I think that's why they like to pretend that the way to solve money laundering is just to get still more suspicious activity reports. And if we can just get another 100,000, then everything will finally be okay.
Was there any stories or examples that you uncovered in the trade-based money laundering world that particularly shocked you while researching the book?
I mean, actually, the beginning of the process that led to this book, was actually a conversation with a source here in the UK about a shopping destination in Oxfordshire called Bicester Village, which is very popular with particularly Chinese tourists. There's a statistic, actually I'm not entirely sure what the source of the statistic is, but it's regularly quoted, that it's the second most popular destination for Chinese tourists in the UK after Buckingham Palace. And it is a mall in a field in Oxfordshire. There's nothing particularly interesting about it, but it sells luxury goods at relatively cheap prices. And essentially, as I was told by the police source, is that you have these very large money laundering gangs controlled by essentially Chinese gangsters who are working to enable capital flight out of China. And one of the key ways that they do it is by essentially spending money that originates in criminal gangs in the UK at Bicester Village to buy luxury handbags and then shipping them back to China as a way of moving value outside of the financial system. We see exactly the same thing in the luxury boutiques of Paris or Milan. We see a similar phenomenon, though not in the form of luxury goods, in the casinos of Las Vegas or Vancouver or Sydney. This form of essentially moving value in the form of favors or in the form of debts or in the form of luxury goods is deeply, deeply embedded in the way that money laundering works. And what's really interesting about it is this isn't new at all. I mean, we're only beginning to understand it now, but this is actually how the Medicis used to move value back in the Renaissance Florence. They didn't used to move bullion from, say, Florence to Bruges or from Venice to London. They moved value in the form of spices or silk moving north or wool moving south, and they just played around with the invoices so they could hide a bit of money in the shipments. And this is essentially what the big now international Chinese money laundering gangs are doing. They've become incredibly good at hiding value in the shipments of goods around the world that they control. So, yeah, I found that, I don't know if I'd say I found it shocking, because I've kind of sat with it for a while, so I can't really remember at the time, but I found it incredibly eye-opening to realize that there was this whole other essentially shadow financial system, which parallel to the Hawala system in the Middle East, I suppose, but this shadow financial system that exists globally outside of the banking system and which has almost no oversight essentially at all.
If the same methods are being used now by organized criminal Chinese gangs and it was used by the Medici in Renaissance Italy, is there an argument then to be made that just financial crime is just a part of the economy?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's true. Financial crime will always be a part of the economy as long as it remains profitable. The challenge is to make it less profitable, because the less profitable you can make it by making money laundering more expensive, then the less crime there will be, because it will be, lots of crimes that are currently profitable to commit will cease to be so. By putting costs on the gangs, you reduce their activities. I do think that there is a problem with the way we're approaching money laundering, what I call the sort of boiling the ocean approach, which is this idea that you can just stop it. The idea that that is conceivable. I think we need to recognize that that isn't the case. In a world that had no money laundering would be a world whereby every shipment of goods would be examined. Every single financial transaction would be examined. The contents of your wallet could be examined at any moment. No one wants to live in that world. But I do think we want to live in a world where there is less, significantly less financial crime. And that involves governments being willing to do the same kind of work that they've been expecting of others. If you look at the kind of fines that, say, the US government has levied on financial institutions, like BNP Paribas, for example, or whichever, 9-figure sums. And yet, at the same time, it's the US government that's printing all of these cash dollars that are the most useful tool for financial criminals globally. And yet it doesn't impose any of those equivalent fines or indeed equivalent scrutiny on itself. That's what we need. We need a recognition that everyone is part of the problem, and therefore everyone needs to work hard to try and solve it, or at least ameliorate it, so that we can reduce the kind of scourge of fraud and kleptocracy that's really beginning to sweep over the world in a really worrying way.
You mentioned the US, and I think on the last show you said that, the US is is, of course, key in fighting money laundering and in money laundering globally. But how do you see that developing now? What's your view on that?
I'm an optimist, and I'm always hopeful that things will be better. But there are lots of very worrying developments at the moment, and I'm particularly concerned by the willingness of the current administration in the United States to embrace crypto, and to embrace crypto in ways that are so wildly different to all previous administrations. I mentioned how Howard Lutnick, going to Davos and saying, we're the sheriff now. He's the previous head of, the financial institution Cantor Fitzgerald, which is now run by his son. And it's Cantor Fitzgerald that essentially has provided the wherewithal for Tether, the big stablecoin company, to operate. It has a significant stake or a significant convertible bond, which can be turned into a stake, which is worth certainly billions of dollars on current showing. And yet, if you look at the latest analysis from Elliptic, you can see that Tether's signature product, USDT, is being used by the Iranian regime to finance itself. It's being used by the Russian regime to evade sanctions. It's being used by the scam farms of Southeast Asia. It's being used by the Venezuelan regime to dodge sanctions. There's a very weird disconnect between, we are the sheriff, while at the same time, a senior member of the administration's own company was the one that essentially got a crypto firm on the road that is providing a product that's helping all of the enemies of the United States to evade the sanctions it imposes. And we also see, multiple companies, whether that's, Tron, the blockchain being allowed to list in New York and therefore sort of cash out, despite the fact that they too are enabling huge quantities of illicit transactions, that's by their own admission. There does seem to be a really worrying willingness in the United States to embrace some of these, frankly, alarmingly under-regulated companies that are, that don't have significant compliance departments, that don't appear to have any kind of proactive tools to tackle financial crime at all. It's very much sort of reactive. And this is being very profitable for individual members of the administration or for close family members of theirs, and that I find very worrying.
I see we're a bit over time, but I do have a question back to the book. And that was, you went to a lot of different places on a tour. Maybe I should call it like an AML tour around the world. What was the most eye-opening location? Like, where did you go and what was the most eye-opening location?
I was in Latvia. I was in the United Kingdom, obviously, where I live. I was in quite a lot of places in the United States, particularly Texas, on the trail of Wright Patman, the father of anti-money laundering legislation. I was in the Marshall Islands, which was fascinating, and probably other places that I've forgotten. But the place that I was most interested by and that I would most like to go back to was the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands. It's one of these strange, far-flung bits of American territory, which is American but not technically part of the United States. So it doesn't have it doesn't send a voting member to Congress and so on. But it is an American jurisdiction, and it has been using that fact to, essentially make money from itself by facilitating all kinds of wrong behavior, particularly by providing a base for casinos, which have moved genuinely unimaginable quantities of questionable cash in really appalling ways. It was fascinating. I mean, leaving aside the fact that it's a beautiful place to visit in its own right, it was absolutely fascinating to see the extent to which these places could be corrupted and how quickly and easily. It was a real sign of the vulnerabilities that we all face, I think, but really made much more visible because the place was so small and therefore so vulnerable to the form of corruption, that we were just talking about.
While you were there, could you see any money or laundering of values or moving of values in these casinos if you visited?
So I missed the casino because it was closed by the time I got there. But this hasn't just happened once. That this sort of the zombie of the casino keeps, rearing back into life on different islands in the CNMI. But there is, a couple of these derelict casinos, one only recently derelict, one more long-term derelict. And I did have this extraordinary experience. I invaded one of the casinos through a broken window, and there was just sitting there in the casino all of the records. You could see all the records of where the money had moved in, where the money had moved out. It was a genuinely amazing and eye-opening experience, and also absolutely terrifying. I was on a very small island in the middle of the ocean with no easy way of escaping, and I had in my hands the proof to put, really, I don't know how many people behind bars, and I completely freaked out, and I'm afraid I ran away. So, it is an alarming thing to be doing this work. And, but at the same time, it becomes a funny story if you survive. So it's always worth it.
All right. Before we end this episode, we're going to dish out some quick fire questions for you. So I'll say something and then one sentence, first thing that comes to mind. Can you summarize the lesson of your new book in one sentence?
I suppose the lesson is, if you want to fight money laundering, you should actually fight money laundering.
What is the biggest issue with anti-money laundering efforts today?
The biggest issue with anti-money laundering efforts is the fact that governments don't care enough to actually apply the standards to themselves that they insist apply to everyone else.
What gives you hope?
I get hope from the fact that there are so many people who continue to fight against money laundering, who recognise how important it is to try and make it difficult for criminals to keep their money. And while they keep fighting, I think that the war is not yet completely lost.
And finally, have we got AML all wrong?
I'm afraid the answer to that, have we got AML all wrong, is yes.
Oh, that is... well, it can only be better from here. Now everyone needs to fight to improve it.
That's definitely the case.
That brings this spin of the laundry to an end. Oliver, thank you so much for joining me. We've included a link to your new book, but where can people find and connect with you?
So I'm on the socials. I'm on Blue Sky and LinkedIn. You can also find me on Instagram. Not that I put much stuff on there, but, I'm there as well. Or, just find me on podcasts like this one. Maybe one day I'll get invited back and I could be here for a fourth time.
Absolutely. Thanks to everyone who was listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, check out the back catalog. We have now more than 150 episodes. Follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. Please share the podcast on your social media channels. We're really trying now to tie AML to the real world. So if you work in compliance, this is something you should share with everyone, and especially this episode, so you can join the fight. Got something you want to share with us? Send us a message on LinkedIn or on email. Your host for this episode was me, Marit. Our producer was Matthew. Our editor was Dominic. And The Laundry is a podcast proudly produced by Strise. Visit strise.ai for more information. See you next time. We usually have 30-minute episodes. I was like, yeah, that.
You should have said that in the recording.
The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, your AML automation software for faster onboarding, smarter monitoring, and growth without overhead.